My name is Tara, and 7 years ago I moved from Canada to Scandinavia. And I feel like this could be the shortest video I've ever done because the reason that I moved to Scandinavia is right here. High five. All right, let's do this. Okay, but all jokes aside, there is a story here, and it's not necessarily a love story, at least not in the way that you might expect. It's true, I fell in love with a Dane and that brought me here, but I think what I didn't expect was that I was gonna fall in love with Scandinavia as a whole. I'm a bit of a nomad and I've moved around cities and provinces in Canada and even to other countries, but for me, nowhere has felt quite like home as much as Sweden and Denmark and Norway have. My first trip to Scandinavia was actually where Lucas and I met. It was on campaign with Sea Shepherd. I was making videos about raw food back then, and I really thought that I would just leave campaign and never return. And if you had told me that only a few years later, I'd end up selling pretty much everything I had, stuffing my essentials into my backpack, and flying across the world with my dog Pepsi to live in a tiny home in Sweden with Lucas, I would have called you crazy. But we just happened to be really lucky, and the circumstances lined up perfectly, allowing me to transition from temporary residency in Sweden to permanent residency in Denmark. And I feel like that's where our adventure truly began. So we moved to Denmark, bought a little cottage by the coast, and only a few months after moving in, the pandemic hit. Like pretty much everybody else, we were cooped up with no air travel in our future, and in true me fashion, I was getting really restless without the change of scenery and adventure that I crave. So, as I usually do, I started dreaming up ways that we could explore closer to home. We had already enjoyed a few years in Sweden, and while I liked the pretty countryside of Denmark, what I really had my sights set on was the rugged wilderness of Norway. We knew we wanted an adventure, and with Almonds Right allowing us to set up camp virtually anywhere and the world in lockdown, there was only one option: to travel on the road and start van life. Except there was one problem, and that's that getting a van in Denmark is insanely expensive. And with all the necessary fees and taxes, our dreams were squashed pretty quickly. But then we found an alternative solution: to get a tow-behind camper. It's not as sexy, I'll admit, but we started searching and I found one on the first day of our search. And with Lucas shaking his head and probably wondering what he'd gotten himself into, but all the while I think still looking excited, we drove to a small island in Denmark and we bought it on the spot. I didn't realize until then, I don't know how I didn't know this, but Lucas had always had a dream of traveling around in a camper. So I feel like it seems fitting that this is where we ended up. You can probably tell from all of my videos that I am big into outdoor recreation. Hiking, kayaking, paddleboarding, camping, bike packing. You ask me to do anything outdoor related and I am there. Lucas, though, is more tech-minded, and he got to spend countless hours nerding out about off-grid setups, and he built a brilliant system complete with solar panels, batteries, new lighting, an upgraded water tank, all the fixtures, and finally, after a long time of renovation, the camper was finally ready to hit the road. And arriving in Norway with its completely rugged landscape with mountains and rivers, lakes and fjords, and the wild forest here, not to mention all the stunning glaciers, it honestly felt like being transported into a dream. I was completely hooked, and I remember crying on our first day, not because I was sad, but because I was happy, because driving through Norway felt like I'd found somewhere where I finally belonged. And after traveling around my entire life pretty much and never feeling like I fit in anywhere, I didn't even know it was possible to find a place that felt like home. Don't get me wrong, Canada is a stunning country. I still miss living there and speaking my native language. I miss being able to just go on spontaneous road trips with my best friend Steph. And one of the things I miss most is the easy way that Canadians form friendships, where you can meet someone completely new and after a short period of time talking to them feel like you've known each other for years. Much of Canada actually looks and feels a lot like the landscapes in Sweden, Denmark, and Norway combined. It's massive and it's majestic, and part of me will always miss it. But there was one thing that always holds me back when I'm in Canada. I don't drive a car, and while living in Canada, that makes for some necessary creativity when it comes to getting around. But in pretty much all of Scandinavia, that's not something that you even have to consider. Public transportation is everywhere. It's all over Sweden and Denmark and Norway, and you can access even the most remote areas without needing to step foot in a car. The trains, buses, ferries, and cycling paths are so easily accessible, and after always feeling like I've been a burden because of my inability to drive, the complete freedom that I have to travel here pretty much anywhere in the 3 countries, it's a relief that's difficult for me to explain unless you've experienced it for yourself. It has given me a level of independence that I have never had before. But for me, it's not just the public transportation that makes Scandinavia an amazing place to live. I feel like the society here is the only place where the American dream is truly alive. And I'll admit, it took me time and Lucas being very patient while explaining to me the way that society works here to shift from the way I was thinking before, which was very me, myself, and I focused. I think it's very common for people to think that way in North America. But now I've kind of switched over to the Scandinavian way of thinking, which considers everybody's welfare. But I see how valuable it is now after living here for the past 7 years. I mean, sure, taxes are high, and don't even get me started on that, but everyone here is taken care of. Suffice to say that living in Scandinavia is kind of like stepping into a fairy tale way of life, except that it is very real. So here we are, living most of the year in our cozy little cottage in the Danish countryside, with a property that we just started a permaculture garden on this year. We're surrounded by the pretty typical Danish landscape, which is lightly rolling hills, farmland, and the Danish coastline. And compared to Sweden and Norway, Denmark is very, very tame, with most of the country being farmland. But even then, I can still appreciate the softness of the landscape and the simple way of living that we've been able to carve out in our small village near the sea. And the remainder of the year, which is my favorite part, we head north in our camper with our pup Pepsi, driving through the more wild landscapes of Sweden and Norway. After all, we didn't just buy a camper to adventure in alone. Being able to take our dog Pepsi with us was a huge deciding factor. And now our little pup from Forest Grove, British Columbia, gets to explore by our sides in our favorite places. And honestly, after 7 years, I do not tire of everything that Scandinavia has to offer. Not only are the landscapes vast and beautiful, from the farmland and rolling hills in Denmark to sky-high mountains and stunning blue glaciers in Norway, but the bright, seemingly endless summers and the dark, cozy winters, for me, it adds this essential contrast to the place that Pepsi and I now call our home. And I really do feel like this couldn't be a better home for us. You see, home has never really been one place, at least not in my life. I find the feeling of home when I'm camped beside a lake, just me and my tent when I'm out on something like a cycling trip. I find home when the 3 of us are cozied up in our camper, arriving to a new location every few nights. I feel it while I'm laying in the hammock in the garden reading a book at our Danish cottage. It's when we're out hiking with only the birds and the sounds of the rustling trees and the river for company. And most importantly, I find it with Lucas and Pepsi. Home is so much more than a dwelling placed in a specific location. What it is really for me is where I feel safe and happy and free to be myself. I have always floated around, never wanting to tie myself to one place, and that's why for me it is perfect that all of Scandinavia is my home. Thank you so much for watching and listening to my story of why I chose to move from Canada to Scandinavia, and I will see you in the next video.